What's up everybody, my name is Max and today I'll show you how I made one of the sounds featured in my preset pack Cinematic Power for Native Instruments Massive. But instead of just showing you where the knobs go and what buttons to push, I want to explain the sound to you from the ground up so you can get an understanding of it. Before we get started, I'll just play this preset a little bit for you to demonstrate the kind of sounds that you can get out of this preset. So as you can hear, it's a pretty simple bass sequence using this step sequencer to affect the pitch, making a melody, and using this LFO to affect the filter cutoff, which makes it kind of plucky. But what it also does is use the modulation oscillator to apply filter frequency modulation. So let me just turn off a few parameters and then we'll try to rebuild the sound from there. So now I've turned off a lot of parameters. I turned off oscillator 3 and 1. I'm just using this oscillator 2, just using one filter, no effects, no inserts, no noise, no modulation oscillator. I'll just turn this one off. Just filter being affected by one LFO and it sounds like this. Pretty simple, just one note being affected by this LFO. If I turn this off, it's just one constant sound. Now, if we want to bring back the melody, what we have to do is turn back the amp of step sequencer 7. And just on a note, this amp, you can imagine this amp like a dry wet knob. So this would be 100% dry, so nothing of this is applied. And this would be 100% wet, so all of this is applied to this amount. But also what you will hear is, if I turn this up, the sound will go down. Now you might wonder why is that? Because here I specified that this sequencer should affect this pitch in a negative range. So if the higher this value goes, the lower this note is affected. You could do it exactly the other way around, so have this at a positive value and then change this sequence. While I was doing the sound, it just happened to be done this way and it turned out good, so I did it this way. So the next step would be making this a little bit more interesting, because after a while, hearing this same linear drop all the time gets a little bit boring. So what I did here is have another pattern, another waveform affect the way this moves. But instead of just moving this knob right here, which determines how much of this waveform and how much of this waveform is applied, which would sound like if it's in the middle, it would kind of make a mix of the two, which sounds like this. It kind of takes away the decay, it makes it a bit more soft. But what I did is modulate this with another LFO, which looks like this, and which we can also turn on and off. And this is the pattern macro, because if this is turned on, if I move this, the way the filter is modulated changes. So I'll just have this on fully on right now. And now what you can hear is sometimes you will have this one, and sometimes you will have this waveform affect the pitch. And the way this changes is applied by this LFO. If I turn off the speed, now this changes really quickly, but that might be too quick, so I'll turn it back down again. And then at your discretion, you can choose how much of this you want to apply. I mean, this is a pretty simple form of doing it. I could take like a crazy waveform. Oh, that's cool. but it would turn into something completely different. But for this sound, I thought this waveform fit quite well. But let's make it more interesting. Let's bring back the filter modulation. So what filter modulation does is this oscillator moves at a certain speed, which is determined by the pitch, and that speed determines, basically it does exactly the same as this, but only in a fixed waveform, and it can go crazy fast. Like if I turn it up to a really high pitch, it will move this incredibly fast. If I turn it low, it'll move it slower, but still not as slow as an LFO, because LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. This is also just an oscillator, but quicker. So let's turn it back to original value. As of yet, nothing will happen because the amount of filter modulation applied is determined by this knob. Right now it's at 0, and I have a macro control, but it's also at 0, but there's also an LFO on it, LFO 6. Let's take a look at this one. It's also a step sequencer. And again, this one right now is not doing anything because the amp is also turned to 0, which corresponds to this macro control. But let's hear what happens when I turn this up. So now what you can hear is that this step sequencer, it applies another kind of rhythm to the sound. Like every time these spikes hit, there's an amount of distortion being applied. But if it's only so short, then you hear it as a rhythm. So with this macro control, I can control the amount, again to give me more control and flexibility. But I can also turn up the filter modulation being applied in general to make it more aggressive, which corresponds to this macro control. So the last thing that's left is the filter modulation pitch, which is this macro control. And again, if I move this, it changes how fast this one modulates this filter. If I turn the filter off, it does nothing because it can't affect anything. It needs a filter to apply filter modulation. So usually when you apply filter modulation, you can, if it's fast enough, you will hear a second tone. That is because the waveform or the filter is being modulated so quickly that the changes themselves, they oscillate and it makes you hear a sound. So if I change this filter modulation pitch, this right here, you will hear a pitch going up and down, but if I just leave it at a value, it sounds more like a color being added to the root note, which we can still hear. So playing with this macro control is kind of just like adding color to the original sound, and then it's a matter of deciding how much frequency modulation do I want and how much of the bass sound do I want. One of them I use with these macro controls, and also I called this one byte, but it's pretty much just adding more frequency modulation. But if I want more of the bass sound, I need to turn up the cutoff. I find it usually sounds best with having the cutoff low and doing more with the filter modulation. And then lastly, we can turn our effects back on, our delay and our reverb, to give it a bit of space. And both work well with the rhythm and the melody. And that's pretty much all there is to this sound. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I will be doing more of these kinds of videos, so if there are certain things you'd like to see, let me know as well. So that's it for today. If you like this sound and want to get the preset, I've posted a link to my website where you can get it below. Also, if you like this video and haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel for more tutorials and updates. See you soon.